We're starting off with Malinowski's Crime and Custom in Savage Society, and the reason for this essentially is that we don't want just to think about what law and legality are. We want to think about how anthropologists approach law and legality. And this text is sort of a classic text in not necessarily in legal anthropology, but in sort of the foundation on which legal anthropology would build itself. Malinowski opens with two what he thinks of as mistaken views that anthropologists have taken up with respect to what they call savages. So he uses the term savages throughout the text. It was a term that was current at the time that he was writing. So he was writing in the parlance of his time. But you see in the text that he sometimes puts it in inverted commas, as if to signal that this is a term that doesn't quite sit right with him, that he recognizes that this is the lingua franca of anthropology at the time that he's writing in the early 1900s, and yet it's a problematic term as well. And so part of the work that he does in this book, as well as in his other works, is to undo some of the prejudice built into the term. In any case, so I'll continue to use the term because he does in the book, but it's important to have some sense of that context in which he's using it, presenting it. Okay, so back to the point. He thinks that there are these two mistaken views that anthropologists have produced. The first is to consider the savage as this lawless, almost animalistic being. And in some respects, this is born out of the political theory and political philosophy that predates anthropology, to which some anthropologists, early anthropologists, are responding. Ideas like the noble savage that appear in the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau or John Locke, and that have a certain kind of baggage attached to them, that think of the savage, the humans in nature, as it were, as this kind of lawless, almost animalistic being. So that's the first picture that he finds unpersuasive. He thinks, though, that then anthropologists overcompensated with respect to that view and present then this idea of the savage as this human that is just slavishly conformist, a submissive rule follower, so that following rules or following custom becomes this almost automatic reflexive thing, as if done by an automaton who could not behave otherwise. Malinowski also thinks that this is not an accurate depiction based on his own fieldwork. And so he turns to his work in the Trobriand Islands in Melanesia to try and work out a richer, more faithful picture of law, or the way that members of these communities and societies engage in law-like behavior. Unsurprisingly, then, ideas of law in savage society are the ones that Malinowski is responding to are also unsatisfying for him. Again, because they have either this kind of complete absence, or they have this sense that the members of savage societies simply could not do otherwise than be obedient to the law. So part of the reason for this, he thinks, is that the anthropologists of his time were captured by an idea of law as this central authority imposing itself on a resistant population. And he just doesn't find this persuasive at all. Equally unpersuasive is this idea that savages had some kind of vague feeling about that led them to follow the law, that it was this instinctual thing. Again, he just doesn't find that this is what legal behavior, what law looks like in the societies where he did his field work. He proposes then a shift in focus away from these themes that dominated earlier anthropological work, so that earlier anthropologists went to the field looking for forms of authority, looking for codes, courts, government, punishment, as their way of finding law or failing to find it among the communities, among the peoples that they were studying. Malinowski wants to get away from that focus on authority, codes, courts, government, punishment, and instead look at the forces of obligation if we want to understand how law works in Melanesia, essentially. So he describes his project like this. In looking for law and legal forces, we shall try merely to discover and analyze all the rules conceived and acted upon as binding obligations, to find out the nature of binding forces, and to classify rules according to the manner in which they are made valid. In this way, then, he'll distinguish law from custom, so that he recognizes, of course, that customs exist, but that he doesn't think of law as simply another form of custom, that we can distinguish it in some kinds of ways. He, as I say, turns to his work in the Trobriand Islands to get a handle on this. So here you see the Trobriand Islands, just off the east coast of Papua New Guinea, northeast of Australia, and you'll see that they are scattered throughout the Western Pacific. So they are far-flung oceans. This is for his earlier work, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, this classic work in anthropology, one of the foundational texts of anthropology, arguably. One of the things that's fascinating to him is how the Trobriand Islanders would engage in trade and exchange with other Melanesians on these far-flung islands, so that they would set out to cross vast expanses of ocean in these canoes. We're going to talk about them in a moment, and sail around through the Western Pacific to engage in exchange with these other communities, these far-flung communities throughout these islands. Okay, anyway, so this is where he's doing his research. He looks to the field work that he did there in order to contest, first of all, an idea of primitive communism. So he's turning to think about law as it appears within economics. And the prevalent idea that among anthropologists of his time that he's pushing back against is that economics amongst the savages is basically primitive communism, where a community holds all of their material wealth in common. It's not individualized in any sense. And you can imagine then that would have certain implications for how something like legality would make its appearance within economic relations. He pushes back on this. And as I say, he turns first of all to canoes as a way of thinking about the legality of something like property or ownership. And so he looks anyway to the canoes that they use for fishing. They also use canoes to sail across these vast expanses, as I was saying. That's really the Kula exchange, which is, in his view, not an economic exchange, and it's an exchange of symbolically or ceremonially potent items, armbands, and necklaces that have no economic value. They can't be exchanged economically, but they have a great deal of symbolic and social importance, and function. The exchange of these items functions to build a network among the communities in these far-flung islands. He wrote a huge book about that, so I'll leave that at that point. It's not the topic of this book. My point is simply that canoes have a particular salience, a particular importance within the lives of Trobriand Islanders, and so he picks them, the canoes that is, as important objects within the lives of Trobriand Islanders. So canoes matter, in other words. Okay. This is what they look like. As you can see, when he says canoes, he's not talking about crafts that are for one or two people. They have a fairly substantial crew that's involved with building and sailing them. And the fact that there are large crews associated with the canoes has led others who have written about these things to imagine that what they're looking at is property that is communally held. Again, this idea of primitive communism. And Malinowski is going to say, no, that's not the case. That yes, there are crews, so that there are large numbers of men who are associated with any given canoe, but that doesn't mean that they hold it communally. He says, the ownership of a Trobriand fishing canoe is defined by the manner in which the object is made, used, and regarded by the group of men who produced it and enjoy its possession. The master of the canoe, who acts at the same time as the head of the team and as the fishing magician of the canoe, has first of all to finance the building of a new craft when the old one is worn out, and has to maintain it in good repair, helped by the rest of his crew. In this, they remain under mutual obligations to one another to appear each at his post. That is, different people have different jobs with respect to an individual canoe, while every canoe is bound to come when a communal fishing has been arranged. Right? So that even though the canoe might be the possession of a particular individual or a particular group of people, that doesn't mean that it is something that they hold without any other obligations beyond that group. But it also is not the same thing, he says, as communal possession, that it is not simply the property of the community. He says, rather than communal ownership, what we find is a definite system of division of functions and a rigid system of mutual obligations into which a sense of duty and the recognition of the need of cooperation enter side by side with the realization of self-interest, privileges, and benefits. Right? So this is not a picture of primitive communism that we get here. But also, importantly for the purposes of his book, the way that these duties, obligations, interests, privileges, and benefits are laid out, these have a legal character to them then. They can't simply be set aside. They can't simply be ignored. Individuals don't have a great deal of choice over whether they observe them or not. That this sense of obligation has this kind of legal character to it. So then the duties, privileges, and mutualities bind the joint owners both to the canoe, so to the object, and this of course applies to other objects as well, and to one another. So that it's not just a relationship to the object, but that it is a social relationship among the members of the owning memberships, but also more broadly to the community, in that they will have a certain responsibility to fish to bring in fish that the community then will have some kind of claim on. We'll see that that's the nature of that claim is complex because it involves exchange with producers of vegetables inland who are not, by definition, the fishermen. And so the nature of that obligation is what he wants to get into, and the way that it's a kind of legally binding obligation. This is what he wants to explore. Okay, so the binding force of economic obligations. Here we are. Malinowski stays with economic exchange to show that economic exchange, isn't simply a question of exchange of goods, but it has this kind of ceremonial and legal dimension to it as well. He writes, "We find a system of mutual services and obligations based on a standing arrangement between two village communities." So as I say, coastal fishers on the one hand, inland farmers on the other hand. The inland village supplies the fishermen with vegetables. The coastal community repays with fish. This arrangement is primarily an economic one. It also has a ceremonial aspect, for the exchange has to be done according to an elaborate ritual. But there is a legal side, a system of mutual obligations which forces the fisherman to repay whenever he has received a gift from his inland partner and vice versa. So we note something here right away. Each individual fisherman has an inland partner with whom he exchanges, and vice versa. So it's not something like an open market where you just exchange with anyone. Neither partner, he goes on to say, can refuse, that's the legal aspect, neither may stint his return gift, neither should delay. There is then not just this kind of material economic reliance of the communities on one another, one having in abundance what the other has none of, and vice versa. So it's not just this, as I say, sort of an open market of anonymous exchange. It's not like going to a Walmart where you don't know the cashier, probably you don't know, the cashier who you're paying for the goods that you take, where all of the economic arrangements are anonymous, impersonal in nature. This is not the model that pervades in the Trobriand Islands. Rather, as he says, it's the community that has an abundance of one thing, fish or vegetables, exchanging with fixed partners in the other community. So fixing whatever they're abundant in for whatever they're scarce in. There is an additional cultural dependence on the partnered communities with a legal dimension to it. Neglecting exchange will result in punishment. So there are sanctions involved if you don't hold up your end. He says each community has a weapon for the enforcement of its rights. I think he uses this word rights advisedly, right? He's trying to get us to recognize that the nature of the claim that each exchange partner has on the other is in the nature of a right. You have a certain claim on exchange with your particular partner. And the model of punishment or the model of sanction comes in the form of reciprocity. He stresses that reciprocity is not limited to fish and vegetables, but many sorts of trade and other services as well. So religious or magical rituals, for example, marriages, what have you, right? So that there are other services as well that so that reciprocity in economic exchange is part of a larger system of mutualities binding exchange partners and communities together. So one way you could think of this is that when an individual goes to exchange the necklaces and armbands of the Kula exchange, again, these things that are purely symbolic or purely ceremonial in their value, not economic in value. They can't be exchanged economically for other things. Necklaces can only be exchanged for armbands and vice versa. They go and they exchange these with fixed partners throughout the islands, and they'll also engage in economic exchange with these partners, right? So that it's not, again, that they go to far-flung island, engage in Kula exchange, and then it's just an open market of economic exchange to bring back home things that exist in this island but that don't exist back home. No, again, the network or the system is a larger one that is sort of all-embracing in the sense that your communities exchange with one another, your villages exchange with one another, individually you exchange with one another in a fixed way, right? Anyway, okay, I'm getting far afield. Let me get back to the text here. With respect to reciprocity and dual organization, Malinowski explores how dual organization, symmetry, and reciprocity relate to one another. Exchange is not random or anonymous, as I was saying, between members of inland and coastal communities, but rather is this highly structured, highly regularized exchange. So that every man has a permanent exchange partner, and they have to deal with each other. Not only for economic exchange, but for ceremonial exchange as well, as I was saying with the example of the Kula, and with the economic exchange that can correspond with the Kula exchange. Within each community, this is Malinowski, again, the individual partners are arranged into totemic subclans so that the exchange establishes a system of sociological ties of an economic nature, often combined with other ties between individual and individual, kinship group and kinship group, village and village, district and district, right? So that what we see is this kind of multi-layered system of exchange, whether it's economic exchange, ceremonial exchange, symbolic, or whatever it may be. He goes on to say, going over the relations and transactions previously described, it is easy to see that the same principle of mutuality supplies the sanction for each rule. There is in every act a sociological dualism, two parties who exchange services and functions, each watching over the measure of fulfillment and fairness of conduct of the other. Now, Malinowski opens this chapter with the point that, of course, there can be other motivations for exchange, like the desire for a good diet. And those motivations, in fact, might be stronger even than the motivations of social constraints to engage in this exchange. But, he says, even given that, regard for others' rights in the exchange, so your exchange partner's rights, remains prominent because there are always some who are going to try to, or at least desire to, escape their obligations, and social constraints are the countervailing force that keeps them from neglecting their obligations. One expression of this is the strict formality attaching to gifts of food, and a related one is how he says, nothing has a greater sway over the Melanesian's mind than ambition and vanity associated with a display of food and wealth. In the giving of gifts, in the distribution of their surplus, they feel a manifestation of power and an enhancement of personality. So this is an interesting point, right? He says that, yes, of course, there's a preoccupation with wealth, primarily in the form of food, but not exclusively. And this shouldn't sound particularly foreign to us. In North America, of course, the display of possessions of the right kind, that's the sort of thing that confers status on people. So this is not an unfamiliar concept for us. What's distinctive, though, that Malinowski wants to point out, is that the way that one gains prestige in the Trobriand Islands is through one's giving. It's one's generosity, one's displays of generosity. That's where status, prestige come from, right? Not from the simple possession and display, but in publicly giving. That is where prestige lies. All right, and this is the point that I was just making. So that social obligations around reciprocity and largesse have the force of law. But Malinowski goes on to say that where a Melanesian can evade his obligations without loss of prestige, he will. Right? So that this idea of individual interest is not absent here. There's not some kind of automatic obedience to the law. Again, this should sound familiar from our own experiences in North America. If there's a way to sort of forego one's obligations and get away with it without losing prestige, he says, well, yeah, that Melanesians will do that. And once again, this shouldn't strike us as an especially aberrant or surprising thing. The key, though, for him is that it's only if they can do it without a loss of prestige. What we can take from this is something that Malinowski raised right at the beginning of the book, that Melanesians, and here he's using Melanesians as exemplars of savages, do not follow custom or obligation automatically, any more than, of course, Americans would follow the law automatically, right? It's not like it's just programmed in and then the program runs. No, it's that people are aware of the law, where they can get away with not following it without a loss, they may. That's the temptation they might well give into. But the fact that it's there has this sort of countervailing force on people. So that even in the case of Trobriand Islanders, if they grumble about and recriminate exchange partners, complaining that they didn't quite get what they should have in exchange for the wonderful fish that they just offered their exchange partner, Melanesians nonetheless will try to fulfill their obligations despite their stated dissatisfactions. Again, because what's important in terms of prestige is not the possession, but the display of generosity. Therefore, we shouldn't really be surprised to learn that, unlike religious commandments, the rules they follow are elastic, that there's room for maneuver or interpretation about what is a satisfactory fulfillment of their obligations. He says then, only willful stinginess, neglect, or laziness are regarded as a breach of contract. Again, I think he's using the word contract advisedly here to carry forward this idea that this is a legal obligation. Since, again, largesse is a matter of honor and praise, the average native will strain all his resources to be lavish in his measure. He knows, moreover, that any excess in zeal and generosity is bound sooner or later to be rewarded. This is an important concept, and it depends entirely on having fixed exchange partners, that your great generosity in this moment will come back to you. And of course, you can see, even just from a self-interested point of view, why this would be. If I've just received a great deal of generosity, I'm going to feel a certain kind of pressure to respond with equal generosity, maybe not just because I care for my exchange partner, that certainly can be a motivation, but also because my own prestige is on the line, right? That the bar has been set at a certain level, and if I want to continue to maintain the prestige that I have through this generous exchange with this particular exchange partner, I have to be able to step up and give as good as I've gotten. Now we can start to see why Malinowski doesn't picture law as simply this machinery for carrying out justice. Machinery like police and courts, the sort of institutional authoritative notion that we might be tempted to think of coming from a North American context, where that's what it looks like. Rather, his view is organized around something different from this kind of institutional authoritarian approach, that it has to do with obligation. So that thinking of law as the form of effective social constraint that makes people keep their obligations, as in the way that, to quote him, many transactions are linked into chains of mutual services, every one of them having to be repaid at some future date, allows for a much more faithful description of law in the life of Trobriand Islanders. Right? So that if you go to the Trobriand Islands, he's saying, and you go with an idea that the way that you find law is to look for these institutions, to look for the way that authority imposes itself upon a reluctant population, you're not going to find things that look like that. Of course, he's doing it in a colonial context, so there's something a little bit fishy in saying that there's no kind of central authority imposing itself. But that aside, he's saying Trobriand Islanders left to themselves, that's not the way that they organize their legal lives. Rather, it has to do with this notion of obligation, not institution and authority. What we might think of as civil law, so law that governs economic relations, and that's what he's been talking about so far, is not the only kind of law that one finds in, as he puts it, tribal life. Ceremonial life also has its legal qualities. So if we take mourning as an example, Malinowski explains that all of the associated ceremonies with mourning ceremonies, are considered an obligation of the performer toward other survivors, right? So it's not an obligation toward the dead, it's an obligation toward those who continue to live. So that when a widow, for example, wails, it is not simply an expression of grief. It is an expression of grief, but it's not just an expression of grief. It also provides satisfaction to this deceased man's brothers and maternal relatives. It's a link in the chain of reciprocity that has its complement down the road when ceremonial feasts and payments by his kinmen will be given to her. Marriage also has its own legal character. Again, not an idea that is alien to North Americans, right? Where, of course, if you want to get married to a justice of the peace, that is a legal process that you go through. Of course, all marriages here have that legal dimension. So once again, when he turns to the idea of marriage as having this legal quality to it in the Trobriand Islands, once more, he's saying it's not because you've declared something in an institutional context that matters. Rather, it's the formation of obligations that gives it its legal qualities. But he says it's not just a matter of forming bonds of obligation between the spouses, but also establishing a relation of mutuality between the husband and the wife's family. And this especially with her brother, assuming that she has a brother. The brother has a duty of care for her, just as she has a duty of obedience to her brother. So that's going to be a crucial relationship that is going to shape the way that marriage takes on this legal this legal character for her and for the husband and for her offspring, as we'll see. We learn that the brother will also hold a special position with respect to the couple's children. So this is not from his book. This is just the way that anthropologists schematize kinship with these sort of kinship charts. So what he's pointing to here, Malinowski, is what is in the literature called the avuncular relationship, the relationship to the uncle. So you have the square is the child, the ego, the one who forms the center of the kinship chart, right? So you have the ego there, who stands in a relationship to the mother's brother. That is the avuncular relationship. So just so that we're clear on what we're looking at here, the circle is a female individual, the triangle are male individuals, the sort of inverted square bracket that marks siblings. So the circle and the one triangle are brother and sister. Marriage is the equal sign, so the circle and the other triangle is a relationship of marriage. And then offspring are marked by the downward, the downward line going toward the square, toward the ego here. So you can see then this is sort of a schematization of the relationship that Malinowski is pointing to as central in Trobriand Island life. That is the relationship between the mother's brother and the husband on the one hand and their offspring on the other. That there's a relationship of duty and obedience, not just between the brother and sister, but between the uncle and the children of the woman in this case. All right, so moving on. He says, the brother becomes the natural warden of her children, who therefore have to regard him and not their father as the legal head of the family, so that the responsibilities that the uncle has are of a legal nature, right? That it's not as it would be for me, for example. I have nieces and nephews. My relationship to them is not legal in any way, shape, or form. It is simply a kinship relationship. Their parents are the ones who have a legal relationship to them, or I guess they did when they were minors, but not me, right? Not in the Torbian Islands. In the Torbian Islands, I would have a legal relationship with my sister's offspring. Okay, so, and equally, so they have a certain kind of duty of obedience to the uncle, but the uncle in turn has a duty to look after the children of his sister and his sister with a considerable proportion of his food. Okay, so let me just read. I butchered this whole quote now. Let me go back and get the quote right. He says, "The brother becomes the natural warden of her children, who therefore have to regard him and not their family as the legal head of the family. He in turn has to look after them and to supply the household with a considerable proportion of its food." And this is part of the reason that prestige attaches to a bountiful harvest and why a man will display his yield. It announces publicly his ability and his desire to look after his relatives' needs, right? So once again, his wealth is not about how great he is as a holder of wealth. His wealth is a marker of how great he is in looking after others by giving his wealth to them. His generosity is going to be what makes him great. Hence, he will amass his, say, yams as an example of one of the relevant crops for all to see at his place before delivering them and reassembling the mound at his sister's household, where again it will be publicly displayed for all to admire so that they can recognize what a great provider he is. Malinowski says, "The whole ceremonial side of the transaction has a binding force we know already. The display, the comparisons, the public assessment impose a definite psychological constraint upon the giver. They satisfy and reward him. When successful work enables him to give a generous gift, and they penalize and humiliate him for inefficiency, stinginess, or bad luck." Marriage and harvest offerings then are interconnected links in this chain of mutualities, having the force of law, not on account of their institutions or any sort of central authority, but from the obligations they imply. Now, the principle of give and take. Malinowski here gives us the conclusion he draws from his examples: food barter between inland and coastal villages, mourning ceremonies, marriage, about what actually constitutes law in Melanesia. These examples, the examples he's gone through with coastal and inland exchange, mourning ceremonies, and so on, these examples were adduced with some detail in order to bring out clearly the concrete working of what appears to me to be the real mechanism of law, social and psychological constraint, the actual forces, motives, and reasons that make men keep their obligations. In all social relations and in all the various domains of tribal life, exactly the same legal mechanism can be traced, that it places the binding obligations in a special category that sets them apart from other types of customary rules. We can see in each case, economic exchange, magic and religious ceremonies, and so on, that there is a relationship between obligatory reciprocation, this is what Malinowski is calling give and take, and sanctions or punishments. On the one hand, Economic give and take evens out in the long run. I made this point earlier. And again, I made the point connected with this, that relies on exchange occurring between the same partners all the time. That's how you get this balance over the long term. But on the other, failure to fulfill one's obligations will provoke a specific sanction, finding oneself left outside the social and economic order, becoming an outcast. This is why the fixed exchange between specific partners is so important. If you are a bad exchange partner, if you're neglectful, if you don't exchange within the appropriate time frame or with the appropriate value of the goods that you have in exchange, if you're stingy, in other words, it's not like you can just go to some other exchange partner and start exchanging with that individual, right? Even if you find yourself suddenly with an abundant supply of, let's say, yams, and yet you don't have your fixed exchange partner to go to because you've kind of gypped your exchange partner in the past. And so now your exchange partner won't exchange with you anymore. So, okay, so then where do you turn? Others are not going to take you up as an exchange partner, partly because your prestige is in the tank at this point, because everybody knows what kind of an exchange partner you've been, that is a bad one, but also you can't just engage in this kind of free market anonymous exchange that characterizes, say, like the capitalist North American market. You need your fixed exchange partner. Without that fixed exchange partner, you're left outside the social system and economic system of exchange. So you might have a lot of yams, but you're not going to have any fish. Importantly, even though Trobriand Islanders might not be able to describe the entire system of give and take obligations that make up legal obligations, they do know that they exist. They know that they're binding on everyone, and they're aware of the consequences of failing to live up to one's obligations. And of course, you can, again, draw an analogy with the North American setting where we're all aware that there's a legal system. We're all aware of some of the laws, but probably not many of us are in a position that we can describe the entire legal system and all the laws that it contains. But Malinowski's point is the system doesn't require us to be able to do that in order for it to function. The system of obligations in the Trobriand Islanders, among the Trobriand Islanders, similarly doesn't require that each individual have this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the entire system in order for it to work. It's the same kind of thing. It can work simply with an awareness that one has obligations and that one faces peril if one neglects those obligations. Peril of a legal sort. In other words, you face sanctions. Okay, and so that brings us to the end of the first lecture. For the next lecture, we'll pick up with reciprocity as the basis of social structure. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.